The corner table at Mickey's Tavern had been his refuge for months, a place where 78-year-old Navy SEAL veteran could sit with his memories and a whiskey that helped dull the pain of friends who never came home. When the drunk college group decided he was taking up valuable real estate in their bar, they dragged him from his seat and started beating him while shouting insults about useless old men. But when their violence ripped his jacket apart, exposing a SEAL Team 9 tattoo with classified markings, the bartender dropped his glass in shock, because that ink belonged to operators whose missions never officially existed. The neon sign outside Mickey's Tavern flickered between open and darkness, casting intermittent red shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke, stale beer, and the kind of desperation that settles into places where people come to forget rather than celebrate. In the darkest corner of the bar, as far from the jukebox and the pool table as possible, sat a man who had perfected the art of invisibility. At 78, Vincent "Venom" Rodriguez looked like he was made of the same worn leather as the booth he occupied, weathered, cracked, and fading into the background. His clothes told the story of a man who had stopped caring about appearances years ago. A faded denim jacket that had once been black, a flannel shirt that had seen too many washings, and jeans that were held together more by habit than by their original stitching. In front of him sat a glass of whiskey, barely touched, condensation pooling on the scarred wooden table. What the other patrons of Mickey's Tavern didn't know was that Vincent Rodriguez had once been one of the most dangerous men alive. For 26 years, he had served with Naval Special Warfare Command, eventually becoming a member of SEAL Team 9, a unit so classified that its very existence was disputed even within military circles. While the public knew about SEAL Team 6 and their high-profile operations, Team 9 operated in even deeper shadows, conducting missions that were never acknowledged, in places that officially didn't exist on any military map. Vincent had eliminated high-value targets across 4 continents, had extracted hostages from impossible situations, and had completed operations so sensitive that even decades later he couldn't speak about them to anyone who didn't have the highest security clearances. But that was 40 years ago, in a world that had moved on without him as completely as the government that had classified his service record so thoroughly that he couldn't even prove most of what he'd done. Now Vincent Rodriguez was just another old man sitting alone in a dive bar, trying to drown memories that whiskey could never quite reach. The corner table had become his sanctuary, a place where he could sit with the ghosts of teammates who had fallen in places whose names would never appear in history books. Every Friday night for 8 months, he had claimed this same spot. He would order a single glass of whiskey, nurse it for 3 hours, and sit in the relative anonymity that Mickey's Tavern provided. It wasn't about the alcohol. Vincent had learned long ago that drinking didn't solve problems, it only postponed them. It was about the noise, the chaos, the background din of other people's lives that helped drown out the silence where his brothers' voices used to be. Tonight started like every other Friday. Vincent had walked the 4 blocks from his studio apartment, paid his $8 for the whiskey he wouldn't finish, and settled into his usual booth. The bar was busier than normal, a group of college kids celebrating their graduation, their voices loud with alcohol and the certainty of youth. Vincent paid them no attention. He'd learned to tune out the world around him, to exist in the spaces between other people's awareness. But tonight, the world wouldn't let him stay invisible. "Dude, look at that depressing old guy in the corner," came a voice that cut through the bar's ambient noise like a knife. Vincent didn't look up. He'd heard similar comments before. Usually, if he remained perfectly still and avoided eye contact, the speakers would lose interest and find other entertainment. But tonight was different. "I'm serious," the voice continued, closer now. "He's been sitting there, staring at the same drink for like an hour. It's bringing down the whole vibe of our celebration." Vincent finally glanced up to see 5 young men approaching his table. Fresh graduates, probably early 20s, wearing expensive clothes and the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for their actions. They carried their drinks like weapons, sloshing beer as they moved with the unsteady swagger of people who had been celebrating for hours. Their leader was a tall kid named Brett Mitchell, whose polo shirt and designer jeans probably cost more than Vincent's monthly rent. His companions followed with the pack mentality of young men who had learned that numbers made them brave. "Hey, old-timer," Brett called out, his voice carrying across the bar. "You been nursing that same drink all night?" Vincent didn't respond immediately. Experience had taught him that engaging with predators often only encouraged them. Instead, he took a small sip of his whiskey, hoping they would move on. But they didn't move on. "I asked you a question, Grandpa," Brett said, stepping closer until he was looming over Vincent's table. "You deaf, or just stupid?" His companions laughed at this, emboldened by their leader's aggression and their own intoxication. Vincent finally spoke, his voice quiet and hoarse from lack of use. "Just minding my own business." "Your business?" Brett's voice rose with mock outrage. "Your business is making this whole corner of the bar look like a funeral home. We're trying to celebrate here, and you're sitting over here looking like death warmed over." More laughter from the pack. The bartender, a man named Mike Sullivan, who had been working at Mickey's for 15 years, glanced over with concern but didn't immediately intervene. He'd seen confrontations before, and most of them resolved themselves without violence. "Maybe you should take your celebration somewhere else," Vince suggested quietly, his eyes never leaving his whiskey glass. The suggestion seemed to flip a switch in Brett Mitchell, his face flushed red with alcohol and anger. "Maybe you should take your sad sack ass somewhere else," he snarled. "This is a bar for people who are still living, not a hospice for has-beens waiting to die." He grabbed Vincent's whiskey glass and threw it against the wall, where it shattered with a sound that made everyone in the bar turn and stare. "There," Brett said with satisfaction. "Now you got no reason to sit here anymore? Why don't you shuffle off to whatever old folks' home you crawled out of?" Vincent slowly rose from his seat, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body protested every motion. At his full height, he was still shorter than Brett, and decades of aging had left him looking frail compared to the athletic young man confronting him. "I don't want any trouble," Vincent said, his voice steady despite the situation. "I'll just go." But as he tried to slide out of the booth, one of Brett's companions, a stocky kid named Tyler, blocked his path. "Not so fast, old man," Tyler said. "You haven't apologized yet." "Apologized for what?" "For bringing down our celebration with your depressing ass," Brett answered. "For taking up valuable real estate in our bar." Vincent looked around at the other patrons, hoping someone might intervene. But people were either too drunk to notice, too intimidated to get involved, or too used to minding their own business in a place like Mickey's Tavern. "I'm sorry," Vincent said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I didn't mean to bother anyone." "Sorry isn't good enough," Brett said, and there was something in his tone that suggested the situation had moved beyond rational resolution. What happened next occurred with the terrible inevitability of a car accident in slow motion. Brett grabbed Vincent by the front of his jacket and hauled him out of the booth with enough force to send the old man stumbling into the middle of the bar. Before Vincent could recover his balance, Tyler shoved him from behind, sending him crashing into a table. "Look at him," one of the other graduates shouted. "Can't even stand up straight." They surrounded him like a pack of wolves, their earlier celebration transforming into something darker and more violent. Brett delivered a punch to Vincent's stomach that doubled him over, and then Tyler kicked his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the beer-soaked floor. "Useless old man," Brett spat. "World would be better off without you." The beating continued with methodical cruelty. They took turns throwing punches and kicks while Vincent tried desperately to protect his vital organs, curling up on the sticky floor in a position he'd learned decades ago in survival training. "Please," he gasped, the word barely audible over the jukebox and the laughter of his attackers. "Please stop." But his pleas only seemed to encourage them. Mike Sullivan, the bartender, was already reaching for the phone to call the police when the situation took a turn that would change everything. In their enthusiasm to inflict maximum damage, Brett grabbed Vincent's jacket and used it to haul him partially upright for better access to his face. The fabric, already weakened by years of wear and the violence it had just endured, couldn't take the stress. The jacket tore with a sound like thunder, ripping wide across the back and chest, exposing Vincent's weathered torso to the dim lights of Mickey's Tavern. And there, etched deep into the scarred skin across his chest and shoulders, was a tattoo that made the entire bar suddenly very quiet. It wasn't the standard military ink that bar patrons might expect from an old veteran. This was something far more complex, far more deadly, and far more classified. A SEAL trident, larger and more detailed than the usual design, surrounded by symbols and markings that Mike Sullivan had never seen in his 15 years of serving military personnel. Chinese characters, Arabic script, Cyrillic letters, all integrated into a design that spoke of operations conducted across multiple theaters of conflict. And woven through it all were coordinates, dates obscured by artistic design, and call signs that meant nothing to civilians but everything to those who understood. At the center of the chest piece, in letters that had been burned into flesh during a classified ceremony, were 3 words that made Mike's blood run cold. SEAL Team. Below that, a single word in Gothic script, Venom. The 5 college graduates stared at the tattoo without understanding what they were seeing. But Mike Sullivan understood immediately. Because Mike had served 8 years in the Navy, and during his deployment to the Persian Gulf, he'd heard whispered stories about SEAL Team 9. Not the kind of stories that got shared in official briefings or appeared in military history books, but the kind that circulated in hushed conversations among personnel with high-level clearances. SEAL Team 9 didn't officially exist. When asked, military spokespeople would deny any knowledge of such a unit, but among certain circles, it was understood that Team 9 handled operations so sensitive, so controversial, and so far outside normal military doctrine that their very existence had to be deniable. They were ghosts who eliminated problems that couldn't be solved through official channels, assets who could be disavowed if operations went wrong. Warriors who operated in legal and ethical gray zones that regular SEAL teams couldn't touch. And Venom was a call sign that suggested lethal efficiency in close-quarters combat and targeted elimination missions. The glass Mike had been holding slipped from his trembling hands and shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent bar like a gunshot. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Brett looked up from where he'd been standing over Vincent's prone form, confusion and growing unease crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" Mike couldn't take his eyes off the tattoo. "That's not just any veteran. That's SEAL Team." "So what?" Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "So what?" Mike's voice rose with incredulous anger. "SEAL Team 9 doesn't officially exist because their missions are too classified to acknowledge. They're the operators who handle problems that regular special forces can't touch." He pointed at Vincent, who was slowly trying to push himself up from the floor, his exposed tattoo visible to everyone in the bar. "You 5 just beat up one of the most dangerous men who ever lived." The effect was immediate and profound. The 5 graduates stepped back from Vincent as if he had suddenly become radioactive. Their earlier bravado evaporated, replaced by dawning comprehension of what they had done. Other patrons were gathering now, drawn by the commotion and Mike's revelation. Phones came out, taking pictures of the exposed tattoo and the scene of the assault. "That's impossible," Brett said weakly. "He's just some old drunk." "Look at him again," Mike commanded, coming around from behind the bar. "Look at his scars. Look at the way he moves. Look at his eyes. That's not some old drunk. That's a man who has eliminated more enemies than you have brain cells." Mike knelt beside Vincent, helping him to lean against the base of the bar. "Sir, are you injured?" Vincent looked up at him with eyes that held decades of classified operations and unspoken trauma. "I'll be all right," he said quietly, trying to pull his torn jacket back together. But Mike wasn't about to let this go. "You 5 just committed assault and battery," he said to the graduates, his phone already in his hand. "And given who you did it to, this isn't just going to be a misdemeanor." "Wait," Brett said quickly, his earlier aggression completely gone. "We didn't know. We were just—" "Just what?" Mike interrupted. "Just beating up an old man for entertainment? Just deciding that someone who looked different from you deserved to be hurt? By now the entire bar had gathered around, staring at Vincent and the exposed tattoo that told a story most of them could never fully understand. An older man who had been playing pool pushed through the crowd and knelt beside Vincent. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I'm retired Army. 1st Infantry Division. If there's anything I can do—" His voice trailed off as he got a closer look at the tattoo and the scars that covered Vincent's body. Not the clean surgical scars of modern medicine, but the jagged, irregular marks of combat trauma sustained in places without proper medical facilities. "Thank you," Vincent replied quietly, "but I just need to get home." "Like hell you do," Mike said firmly. "I'm calling the police and an ambulance. You need to be checked out, and these 5 need to be arrested." But Vincent raised his hand slowly. "No police," he said. Mike looked at him in surprise. "Sir, they assaulted you. They need to face consequences." "They will," Vincent said, struggling to his feet with the help of the retired Army veteran. "Living with what they did tonight, knowing what kind of men they chose to become, that's consequence enough." He looked directly at Brett Mitchell, who was no longer sneering or confident, but appeared to be on the verge of tears. "You saw an old man sitting alone and decided he was fair game for your cruelty," Vincent said, his voice carrying to every corner of the bar. "You never once considered that he might be dealing with things you can't imagine. You never asked if there was a story behind his appearance. You just saw weakness and decided to exploit it." Brett opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find words. Vincent continued, his voice taking on an edge that made everyone listening feel the weight of his experience. "I've killed men who were better human beings than you are. Enemy soldiers who fought with honor for their beliefs. You don't even have that excuse? You're just bullies who found someone you thought couldn't fight back." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Tyler, who had been one of the most aggressive attackers, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, is there anything we can do? Any way to make this right?" Vincent studied his face, looking for sincerity. What he saw was a young man who had just been forced to confront the worst parts of himself and didn't like what he'd discovered. "You want to make it right?" Vincent asked. All 5 nodded eagerly. "Then remember this moment. Remember how it felt to realize you'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And the next time you see someone who looks different, who seems vulnerable, who doesn't fit your idea of what's normal, remember that everyone has a story. Everyone deserves basic human dignity." The 5 graduates stood in uncomfortable silence, processing the lesson they'd just learned in the hardest way possible. Mike Sullivan, meanwhile, was documenting the scene with his phone, not to shame the graduates, but to have evidence in case Vincent changed his mind about pressing charges. "Sir," Mike said, "even if you don't want to press charges, please let me at least get you a cab home, and your drinks are on the house for life." "That's not necessary," Vincent protested. "Yes, it is," Mike said firmly. "It's the least we can do." As Mike called for a cab, other patrons began approaching Vincent, not to gawk or ask invasive questions, but to simply thank him for his service and apologize for what had happened. A young woman who had been sitting at the bar with her boyfriend approached with tears in her eyes. "My brother was killed in Afghanistan," she said. "Thank you for doing what you did to keep people like him safe." Vincent nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. But perhaps the most meaningful interaction came from an unexpected source. Brett Mitchell, the leader of the group who had attacked him, approached with obvious reluctance and shame. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know sorry isn't enough, but I want you to know that what happened tonight, it changed me. I saw what I'm capable of becoming, and it terrifies me." Vincent looked at him for a long moment. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet," Brett admitted, "but I know I can't be that person anymore." "Good," Vincent said. "That's the first step." The cab arrived, and Mike helped Vincent gather his things. As he prepared to leave, Mike pulled him aside. "Sir, I want you to know that you're always welcome here, and if anyone ever gives you trouble again, they'll answer to me and every other veteran who drinks in this bar." Vincent smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in months. "Thank you. I'll remember that." Over the following weeks, Word of what had happened at Mickey's Tavern spread through the veteran community and beyond. Vincent Rodriguez became something of a local legend, not because people wanted to gawk at him, but because his story served as a powerful reminder about the dangers of judging people by their appearance. The 5 college graduates faced serious consequences. While Vincent didn't press criminal charges, the story spread across social media, and all 5 faced scrutiny from their families, potential employers, and their communities. Brett Mitchell, true to his word, underwent a transformation. He canceled his plans to join his father's real estate firm and instead enrolled in a program that provided counseling and support services to homeless veterans. When asked why, he would simply say, "I learned something important about heroes not always looking heroic." Tyler, the stocky one who had been particularly aggressive during the assault, began volunteering at a local veterans shelter. His experiences there opened his eyes to the struggles facing many former service members, and he became an advocate for better veteran services in his community. The other 3 also made changes in their lives, each finding ways to atone for their actions and contribute positively to their communities. But the most significant change was in Vincent Rodriguez himself. For months, he had felt invisible, forgotten, like a burden on a society that had moved on without him. The incident at Mickey's Tavern reminded him that his service had value, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that there were still people who understood the true cost of freedom. Mike Sullivan became a close friend. Their shared understanding of military service created a bond that extended beyond their initial meeting in the bar. Mike made sure that Vincent's corner table was always available, and that no one ever bothered him unless he wanted company. But more importantly, Mike connected Vincent with other veterans who frequented Mickey's Tavern. What had been a place of isolation became a community where men and women who understood the weight of military service could gather without judgment or expectation. The Navy SEAL Association heard about Vincent's story and reached out to offer support. They helped him access benefits he'd never known existed and connected him with other Team 9 veterans who were still alive and able to speak about their experiences. 6 months after the incident, Vincent received an invitation that would change his life once more. The Pentagon was hosting a closed-door ceremony to honor veterans of classified operations, and they wanted him to attend. Standing before an audience of military officials, intelligence personnel, and fellow operators whose missions remained largely secret, Vincent finally spoke about the burden of serving in the shadows. "We completed missions that officially never happened," he said, his voice steady. "We eliminated threats that the public never knew existed, and when we came home, we couldn't talk about what we'd done or where we'd been." He paused, looking out at faces that understood his experience. "But I learned something important recently. Our service doesn't end when we take off the uniform. Our responsibility to each other, to our communities, to the values we swore to defend, that responsibility continues for the rest of our lives." The applause that followed was respectful but brief. These were men and women who understood that the loudest victories often came from the quietest operations. After the ceremony, Vincent was approached by a young Navy officer preparing for his first deployment with a classified unit. "Sir," the young man said, "I wanted to ask you something. How do you deal with not being able to talk about what you've done?" Vincent considered the question carefully. "You don't deal with it," he said finally. "You carry it. But you don't have to carry it alone. Find your brothers, find your community, and remember that the silence of classified service is shared silence. You're never as alone as you think you are." When Vincent Rodriguez passed away peacefully 5 years later, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. Current and former SEAL team operators served as pallbearers, though many of them couldn't officially acknowledge their connection to Team. Mike Sullivan delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of who Vincent had been. "Vincent Rodriguez served his country in ways most of us will never fully understand," Mike said. "He completed missions that remain classified decades later. He sacrificed more than we can imagine. And when he came home, he continued to serve by showing us what dignity looks like under pressure." The inscription on Vincent's headstone, approved after lengthy discussions with military officials about what could be publicly displayed, read simply, Vincent Venom Rodriguez. His silence protected us all. His example taught us how to live. The SEAL Team 9 tattoo that had shocked a bar full of witnesses had become a symbol of something larger. The recognition that the most important missions are often the ones that receive no public acknowledgement, and that the strongest warriors are frequently those who serve in absolute silence. At Mickey's Tavern, Vincent's corner table remained permanently reserved, marked with a small plaque, in honor of Vincent Rodriguez. He taught us that everyone has a story worth respect. It serves as a daily reminder that behind every face in the bar might be a history of sacrifice and service that deserves recognition. The bar's atmosphere had changed since that night. There was less tolerance for bullying, more respect for differences, and a growing understanding that the quiet person in the corner might be carrying burdens that others couldn't imagine. Brett Mitchell, now a successful advocate for veteran services, often visited Mickey's Tavern to sit at Vincent's table and remember the lesson he'd learned the hard way. I was so focused on celebrating my own success that I couldn't see the success of others, he would tell people who asked about his transformation. Vincent Rodriguez taught me that real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about lifting them up. Vincent Venom Rodriguez completed his final mission not with weapons or tactics, but with the simple power of dignity maintained under pressure. He taught an entire community that heroes don't always announce themselves, that service comes in many forms, and that the most important battles are often fought in silence. And in a world that too often judges people by their appearance or circumstances, that lesson continues to echo every time someone pauses to consider the story behind the face they're seeing. Every time someone chooses compassion over cruelty. Every time someone remembers that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves basic human dignity. The ghosts of SEAL Team 9 continue their eternal patrol in the shadows, their missions unacknowledged, and their sacrifices largely unknown. But in a corner table at Mickey's Tavern, their legacy lives on in the understanding that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that receive no recognition at all.